Hello, and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. You know, it's hard not to overstate just how many important decisions and relationships have been made over a meal, especially in diplomatic circles. History has also shown that what a president says can drive up sales of, say, jelly beans or ruin the reputation of broccoli. Food really brings people together and can have great meaning, from hot dogs at the ballpark to state dinners at the White House. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy called the White House an emblem of the American Republic. And so it would follow, as our guest today will tell us, the food and food policies created at the White House are among the most influential in the world. From a president's preferred snack to magnificent feats of culinary art, the food served at the White House can indicate the state of a nation and can communicate powerful messages to global leaders. We have a really full menu of items to discuss today with our special guest, and I'm very happy to welcome a very good friend to the White House Historical Association, author Alex Prudhomme. His new book is Dinner with the President: Food, Politics, and a History of Breaking Bread at the White House. Alex, let's talk about this extraordinary book. You've been a tremendous friend to the White House Historical Association and helped us in many ways, also writing the introduction to the wonderful book on Chef Haller that we have just published at the White House Historical Association. So we have two really wonderful books that talk about the history and the importance of food at the White House. And of course, food is increasingly important on television and media, and so many shows focused on it. In fact, you have quite a famous relative that's related to food. Tell us about that important relationship.
Well, I grew up with Julia Child, the French chef, as my great aunt. She was married to my grandfather's twin brother, Paul Child. Paul and Julia never had kids of their own, and they very generously treated my sisters and my cousins and me as sort of surrogate grandchildren. So we grew up eating her wonderful food. Thanksgiving was always kind of a fun competition about who could produce the most outrageous side dish. And I heard their stories about living in France and abroad as a diplomatic couple for many years, starting in France, and then they went to Germany and Oslo, Norway. And they were here in Washington, lived in Georgetown for a couple of years. So I helped her write her memoir. It was called My Life in France. Came out in 2006, and sadly, Julia died halfway through the writing of her memoir, and I know she would have loved to have seen the response that we got, but we had a great time together. I look a lot like Paul. I have a similar sensibility to Julia. We are interested in the same things, most notably food and politics. So it was just a great collaboration, and I was very fortunate to work with her.
Well, so many Americans still love to watch her and listen to her stories, and she actually herself participated in a state dinner preparation at the White House and observed this that was televised. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, actually, two state dinners. The first was in 1967. LBJ was in a tough spot. The Vietnam War wasn't going well. The students were protesting. The feminists, environmentalists, and rock and rollers were causing trouble, and he was sort of in a bunker mentality at the White House, wasn't talking to the press much. But Paul and Julia had been diplomats, and they understood the value of a state dinner, the political value, the social value, the gastronomic value, and they suggested doing a behind-the-scenes documentary of what it takes to put on a state dinner. They wanted to show a side of the People's House that the people had never seen before. And everybody said, oh no, Johnson's never going to allow that. But Julia could charm a polecat, as Paul said. And she managed to talk them into it. The guest of honor that night was Prime Minister Sato of Japan, who at the time was a very important ally of ours. Having recently been an enemy, Japan was now an important ally in Asia during the war. And they invited all sorts of glittering stars and baseball players, and so for Julia, this was just a fabulous event. And they spent 3 days here. They shot with real film in black and white. You can see part of it on YouTube, which is fabulous. It's called White House Red Carpet. You see Julia in a wig and a kind of a fabulous coat. She tours the White House, going into the back rooms. She learns about how some of the presidents kept cows in the White House for their milk, in the White House, not just outside. And the sort of pièce de résistance was she got to go down to the ground floor where Chef Henry Haller, the wonderful Swiss chef, was producing the meal for this special dinner. And it's the first time that cameras had been allowed into the White House kitchen. And Julia was a little over 6'2". Haller was about 5'4". So there's photographs of her sort of towering over him.
I've seen those images of her leaning over too.
Yeah. And in fact, if you look carefully, you'll see that she's in bare feet so that she's not towering even further over him. And she's wafting the beautiful flavors out of the pot and tasting the quenelle, which are the little fish dumplings that he made, and this beautiful lobster dish he produced, and the noisette of lamb. And it was really remarkable. One is not allowed to photograph the president eating. So in the eventual telecast, they showed people coming into the White House, getting ready for dinner. Then they cut away to these short documentaries about the kitchen and so on. And then they come back at the end, and the entertainment that night was Tony Bennett, who sang his jazz standards and got so excited he ripped off his jacket and his tie. And at the end, you see the audience, including the president and the prime minister, really relaxing and laughing and clapping and having a great time. And in her voiceover, Julia says, you know, this is what it's all about. These two leaders have serious issues of diplomacy to negotiate, but they are also human beings. And here's an opportunity for them to get to know each other and break bread. And that really inspired her, and so she subsequently would promote the White House kitchen and its food. She advocated for elevating the attention on the White House chef and making it more like the French do, not surprisingly. She returned to the White House 9 years later in 1976 when Gerald Ford hosted Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip for the bicentennial. It was a fabulous event on the South Lawn. They had a big white tent. Everything was meticulously prepared. Chef Haller was still there. 1 hour before the dinner, an enormous storm blew in off the Potomac. Rain and wind, it knocked down the cameras, it flooded the lawn. Everybody's hairdos got wet. Julia had to go back and change her dress, but eventually they got going. And the affair was very different in tone. Ford was running for re-election. Bob Hope's jokes didn't really fly. The Queen made a kind of a boring speech. When Ford danced with the Queen, the Marine Band played The Lady is a Tramp by mistake. But at the end of the day, Julia had a great time because the Queen was one of the few celebrities that she actually enjoyed spending time with and observing up close. She wasn't usually that impressed with celebrities, being one herself, but she really enjoyed it, and being at the White House was always a thrill. Later on, she would continue to visit the White House. She only did those 2 telecasts, but she really took her patriotism and her culinary knowledge and sort of combined them and promoted the White House. And it was really
Wow, that's a wonderful story. And she herself really became a part of White House history, given these stories that you've shared with us today. And like Mrs. Kennedy, she is one person that I would love to have met in life, so I appreciate you sharing your memories of her and these stories with us. Well, let's talk about this wonderful book. We are the guests today of our dear friends at the Hay Adams Hotel here in the President's neighborhood. In fact, just out the window, we can see the north portico of the White House, and they have set this beautiful table for us, somewhat reminiscent of what you might see at a White House meal. But this house that we see, that is the home to America's president and a family, first family, all of our presidents have lived there except for one, George Washington, but he selected the site, and the young Irish immigrant who designed and built the White House. Let's go back to George Washington and talk about what foods were of interest to him. What was dining with the president like in those earliest of presidencies?
Well, it's interesting because we didn't have our own social norms then. We were revolutionaries. We were rejecting the British model, and yet that was the only model we had for things like protocol and etiquette and manners. And this is something that people don't pay attention to, but don't forget, the Americans of those days came from all over the world, and they didn't have a common language or a common way of doing things. Some of them grew up on the frontier and they didn't know how to use a fork, or they would spit on the floor and they would throw their chicken bones, you know. And so people like Washington and Jefferson, who had grown up in a kind of a higher milieu, were inculcated with this British model of socializing, but were rejecting it. And they were trying to figure out, how do we socialize as Americans? So it happened in fits and starts. American cuisine was evolving as a kind of distinct cuisine. The amazing ingredients that we have here, you know, venison and corn and wild turkey and cranberries, all these kinds of things that don't exist in the old country, were applied to French cooking technique, British recipes largely, and then we had slave cooks who brought their own distinct herbs and spices and ways of cooking. They would cook over open fire, which is difficult. You had to be very skilled. And so it was really a way of looking at the nation forming, becoming more than an idea, becoming a functioning system. And in a way, the evolution of American gastronomy is a metaphor for the democracy.
John and Abigail Adams move into the White House in November of 1800, and we have the presidency of the Adams, Jefferson, Madison. What were those early years like, and what was food like in the early nation's capital? This was a city that really emerged from nothing and became the federal city. You have the President of the United States either following the example of those around him or setting the example. Well, tell us those early presidencies, what those were like.
Well, they were very different from each other. It's interesting. The Adamses came from Massachusetts. They were Yankees. John Adams was particularly fond of codfish cakes, and he would have a little tankard of cider every morning for his health, even though he abstained from alcohol. And they didn't have a whole lot of money. They weren't fabulously wealthy. And so there was a certain burden placed on them to host. They were the first family to live in the yet-to-be-completed White House. They moved in when things were still a wreck and under construction. And Abigail Adams didn't really want to come here. She liked being in Massachusetts on their farm, but John was lonely, and he kept writing her these plaintive letters. Please come and help me host. So she comes down reluctantly, brings some of the furniture that they had bought in Europe, and helps to furnish the White House, dries her laundry in what is now the state dining room, helps to cut firewood. And this is a very accomplished woman who was a wonderful writer and a real academic. And there she is out chopping wood and hanging laundry and pitching in. But she definitely felt the pressure to host the public and have the first party at the White House, at the president's house. And she resisted. She didn't want to do that. And she used the excuse that she was waiting for some more china to come. But eventually, on New Year's Day, they hosted their first and last big party. They opened the White House. They didn't serve a full meal. They served punch and cookies and sweets. And it's kind of funny because they were very anti-monarchist, but she sat on a kind of throne-like chair and welcomed the public in. And so this is one of the ironies of White House culinary history, is that sometimes people end up doing things that they are not suited for. So the Adamses were not really suited for hosting big parties, and yet they were chosen by fate to host the opening grand party at the White House. Washington, just to go back to him, you know, he was a Virginia gentleman, a slaveholder, much like Thomas Jefferson, who came after the Adams. And they had a very different, kind of more courtly, more extravagant entertaining style. Jefferson was a natural foodie. He's been called the first great Epicurean president, the only great Epicurean president, really. He had spent time in France. He had a slave chef named James Hemings, the brother of Sally Hemings, who he had trained in top-notch Paris kitchens and brought James back here to cook for him. James didn't cook at the White House, but he did cook wonderful and very important meals for all sorts of leaders beforehand. And then Jefferson had some slave cooks, women here, and he entertained in grand style. And he also followed the French court system of using food as a political and diplomatic tool. He had seen the French court do this, but he also understood it intuitively, which is the power of breaking bread as a means of communication, deal brokering, And he really understood this, and he would invite these miserable congressmen who had come from all over, didn't like each other, were often single men living in boarding houses, lonely, frustrated, and he would invite them to the White House for these weekly dinners. And he kept very careful notes on each of them, who came, who sat with who, what they discussed, what information he gleaned from them. And so he was very practical and pragmatic, even Machiavellian in the best sense, that he understood the value of eating together, where it's a place, it's sort of a neutral space where you put your arms down and you agree to talk. Madison was a little bit like John Adams. He didn't care so much for entertaining. He was interested in the politics and the theory and the power. But his wife, Dolly Madison, was the first great first lady in terms of entertaining. She loved being first lady. She hosted these weekly squeezes, so-called, because they were so popular that everybody had to squeeze into the room. And she used those in a very canny way. She was sort of mentored by Jefferson, and she would host these things for people from all walks of life and different parties, and she would use them to gather intelligence, broker marriages or political deals. She made sure that there was plenty of food and drink. When tempers flared, she'd pull out her snuff box and offer people a pinch of snuff. And she was very careful about letting people know her own stance on things. She was kind of a sphinx. She understood, as Jackie Kennedy would later, that it's important to maintain a sort of a neutral facade in order to benefit her husband's agenda. So those first three were very important. They sort of set the pattern for later presidents and first families.
I want to come back to other presidents, but we talk about Jefferson and the French influence and the introduction of that, which is continued into the 21st century. Tell us about that, the importance, the significance, and the pros and cons of that on White House meals.
Coming from a family with Julia Child in it, I'm biased about this, and I agree with you. I mean, France was our first true great ally, really helped us in the Revolution. And so we had people like the Marquis de Lafayette, who was here, was a gourmet, understood the value of food, helped Jefferson, and Jefferson helped him. So there was a tradition of bringing French chefs here as sort of, if you had a big dinner or an important meeting, you would hire a French chef to come and cook for you. And for the day-to-day cooking, you would use generally slave chefs or hired help. And so the French cuisine has been codified, and so there are certain rules about how one uses certain techniques with which ingredients, and that was very helpful. As I mentioned, there are these wonderful ingredients here, and so the French influence on American cookery was really significant. And someone like James Hemings, for example, really helped to define what we now think of as American food. Because he took French technique, the American ingredients, the British recipes, his own inspiration, mixed them together, and it became sort of known as Virginia cooking or Jeffersonian cooking, but it was really Hemings cooking. You know, Jefferson was this wonderful gourmet, but he never stepped foot in the kitchen except to wind the clock. If you go to Monticello, you'll learn all the history about how the Hemings, not only James but his brother Peter, ran those kitchens and produced these spectacular meals. The second kitchen at Monticello was sort of the most cutting-edge kitchen in America. It was even better than the one at the White House. And that's how seriously Jefferson took food. And of course, people like Lafayette would often visit him here or there. And so the French influence continued, and you know, all through history there have been French cooks. The Kennedys famously hired René Verdun and really helped to change American cooking in the 60s and 70s by setting an example.
Well, Julia Child and her interaction with Chef Holler, and the White House Historical Association has just published a book of Chef Holler's recipes, which are really family friendly. You can make these as a family. It's not something only you would serve at a state dinner. Tell us a little bit about his cooking and applicability to family living. And you wrote the introduction to that book graciously for us, and tell us what you shared with us about him in your introduction.
Well, Chef Holler was a classically trained chef, but he was also very pragmatic, and he would cook for whoever was in the White House and give them what they wanted. And the cookbook is full of wonderful recipes. I've made a number of them. Blueberry muffins, the Carter's grits and eggs. Some of them are pretty advanced. There are some lobster dishes, for example, that will stretch your abilities in the kitchen, but there's plenty of things that are day-to-day recipes. And one of the things that Julia Child liked about Holler was that his adaptability. His predecessor, René Verdon, famously quit the White House because LBJ wanted ribs and beans and things that Holler didn't consider worthy of ladies in white gloves, as he said. But Holler came in and said, the president is the boss, I'll cook whatever they want. And so that can apply to sandwiches or simple pies and desserts. He also did a wonderful thing, which is he taught some of the first children how to cook and brought them down to the White House kitchen and gave them cooking lessons. He was the longest serving White House chef. He served for 5 administrations. And this book is a memoir/cookbook. I highly recommend it to people, and it's great that the association has reissued it. And I wrote a little introduction talking about Julia and Holler and their friendship that lasted many years and was really genuine.
Well, the first president moves into the White House in 1800, but it's not until 1874 when the first formal state dinner is held in the White House during the Grant presidency. Share that story with us.
Well, U.S. Grant was a military man, and when he moved into the White House, he liked military-style food, meaning big, thick slabs of turkey and roast beef and joists of cheese with apple pie. But Julia Grant, his wife, had higher aspirations. She had social ambitions. So she renovated the kind of falling apart White House. She fixed up the kitchen. She bought herself some new clothing and some new furniture. And then finally she got rid of this quartermaster in the kitchen who believed that more is better and replaced him with a wonderful Sicilian-born cook named Valentino Mela, who was known as the Professor, because he was such a skilled technician in the kitchen. But also he had this wonderful, deep knowledge of culinary history. And he would produce these fabulous meals that the burgeoning press loved to talk about. And as you said, the first state dinner for a foreign dignitary was held in 1874 for King Kalakaua of what was then called the Sandwich Islands, which we now call Hawaii. This story is great because it talks about the politics of food and the food of politics, which is really the theme of my book. Kalakaua wanted to get rid of the rice and sugar tariffs that America was placing on the Sandwich Islands. And so he came to Washington and had a meeting with Grant. And Grant thought that this was a pretty good idea. And so they worked out a deal behind the scenes where the Americans were given access to Pearl Harbor and a toehold in Hawaii. And in return, the Hawaiians were allowed to start exporting sugar and rice to the States. And that began 150 years of phenomenal diplomatic, economic cooperation. But as the Hawaiians feared, the Americans slowly moved in and took over and eventually named Hawaii the 50th state under Eisenhower. And that dinner was cooked by the Valentino Mela. The menu no longer exists, sadly, but we can infer from his other meals that there were some 30-odd courses, starting with a light consommé, gaining steam with a chicken dish, really powering with some red meat, slowing down with some salad, and about 18,000 desserts. Kalakaua was known as the Merry Monarch. He loved to eat, but he brought 2 food tasters with him, just to make sure he wasn't poisoned, who stood on either side of his chair. The Americans had never seen this before. He wasn't the last to do that, but he had a terrific time, and the deal was worked out, and it was the Grants from Missouri who established the template for what is now a pretty similar state dinner.
I think most people see these beautiful pictures of a state dinner and this elegant dining and don't really understand social diplomacy or food diplomacy and the intricacies of that. Explain to us why taking care of business around a table can be more beneficial or oftentimes more valuable than just a meeting in an office.
Well, there's something about food that gets to our primal brain. If you see somebody wearing a similar shirt to you, you think, oh, that's a nice shirt. But when you see somebody eating the same food that you like, that goes to your prehistoric cortex, and it tells you, okay, that person's of the same tribe as me. And this goes back to the days when food was life and death every day. It's also something about human nature. We love to eat together. Even if we disagree, we like to sit down and eat and talk. It seems to be hardwired into us. And we get endorphins flowing by sitting there together and eating. And so traditionally, this notion of breaking bread has been the dining table is a neutral space where you put down your sword or your gun and you eat together and you work things out. It's fascinating to me about which first families understood this and which don't. So someone like Thomas Jefferson or Jackie Kennedy or Nancy Reagan understood intuitively the value of having meals together. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And this is a good way of doing that. And it's a tool of communication. It is fascinating from a sort of a human perspective. And then politically and diplomatically, it's a way of having conversations outside of the normal channels. The press is usually not allowed at these tables, and so people can have frank conversations. Nancy Reagan always said, you can get a lot of business done at these dinners, which is true. So whether it is a luncheon for the cabinet or a congressional picnic on the lawn or a simple sandwich in the president's private dining room or a fabulous state dinner, there's something food-wise going on at the White House almost every day. And each one carries a message with it. It's not simply having a meal. There's usually various audiences that these meals are designed for. It could be an audience of one, or it could be an audience of millions if you're having a state dinner. And it is a very important tool of communication.
Desserts at the White House. The sweet is a popular part of every meal for all Americans. Susie Morrison, the current pastry chef at the White House, is wonderful. Chef Roland Mesnier, perhaps one of the most iconic of White House pastry chefs, was a dear friend to the White House Historical Association, sadly passed last year. Tell us about the range of desserts at the White House and describe some of those to us.
Well, many people know about the famous gingerbread house that the White House Pastry Kitchen constructs every year at Christmas time, and it is remarkable. Roland Mesnier was kind of a grumpy guy, but a kind of a genius, too. I mean, you see the desserts. There's many photographs online or in his book that you can see of these marvelous creations, and he would make these beautiful spun sugar kind of sculptures, which sometimes caused tensions with people. If you had a donkey and an elephant in the wrong way, and he would use special molds that he'd bought in France.
And some molds he made himself.
And some
he created
himself.
them.
Yeah, he was really amazingly creative, and he was a true artist, really. Overall, the ice cream was brought to America by Jefferson and James Hemings. One of his famous desserts was vanilla ice cream served in a warm puff pastry, which kind of blew people's minds back then because it was cold inside but hot outside, and how did he do this? And it was something that Hemings had learned in Paris, and it was like a real showstopper. And by the way, a good diplomatic tool. Jefferson would save that dessert for very special occasions, and he'd bring it out. And people understood that message, that if you were eating at the White House and you were given a special dessert, that was a real acknowledgement that you were someone to be contended with. And who doesn't like sugar?
That's right. Well, not every meal at the White House is a state dinner, and not every table is set like this one behind us. How do presidents and first families eat on a day-to-day basis? And could they just go downstairs to the kitchen and whip up something? Do they have a kitchen up in the residence? How do they live like normal Americans live with food on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the background to that is people forget that the White House is an actual functioning home. It's not just a symbol of the nation and a sort of a nerve center. It is a home, and there have been first families that have lived there. There are 3 kitchens there. There is the executive kitchen on the ground floor. There's the pastry kitchen, and then in the private residence in the East Wing, there is a personal kitchen. And some first families have a personal cook up in that personal kitchen. People might remember Sam Cass, who cooked for the Obamas, who then became not only a cook but also a food policy guy. Zephyr Wright was a black woman who cooked for the Johnsons, cooked the kind of Texas food that they liked. So sometimes those personal chefs took on a kind of a meaning of their own. The first families are humans, and they have quirky tastes. Some people like to go cook their own meals. I came to believe that Dwight Eisenhower was actually the best presidential cook. He was a guy raised on a farm, taught to hunt and fish and cook by an illiterate woodsman. He cooked for his family. Mamie didn't like to cook. He made sure his troops were well fed during the war. He lived by the maxim, army runs on its stomach, attributed to Napoleon. And he always made sure that his troops were well fed, and people believed that that was one of the reasons that they were so successful during D-Day. Then, as president of Columbia University, he contributed a 2-page hand-typed recipe for vegetable soup. And I've made this thing, and it's fabulous. It literally takes 2 days to make. You start with a big beef bone, you've got to boil it down, and the whole house is redolent of beef broth and barley and vegetables, and it's really fabulous. And when they published that recipe, it caused a sensation across the country. But Ike liked to cook steaks. You go up to the White House roof.
Well, he had an unusual way of grilling, too,
He
to
did.
most Americans.
He
Tell us
did.
about that.
Well, I include a few recipes in this book. One of them is Eisenhower steak, so-called, in which you prepare a grill with high-quality charcoal, and then instead of using the grill top, you simply stick the steak into the embers, and you sear it on the outside, flip it, sear it again, and you get this delicious char on the outside, leaving the inside pink. And people always worry about, well, what about the ash?
Yes.
And you know, it's not a problem. You just brush it off, and I recommend it to people. It's really fun to do. Each first family has their own familial traditions or their regional cooking. I mean, Carter was probably the second best presidential cook. He was also a farm boy. His brother Billy had this wonderful vegetable garden, so every time they went back to Plains, they'd have a huge cookout, and he also liked to hunt and fish. And the Reagans loved to watch television and have their TV dinners, so-called. They weren't the kind in the silver tray. They were actual dinners, but they had little folding tables in front of them. So everybody brought their own style of eating to the private quarters.
And the Obamas were known to try to have a family dinner around the table
Yep,
every evening
every
with the young
evening.
girls.
Yeah, that's right. President Obama liked to go home, meaning going over to the East Wing to have dinner, and then he'd go back to work in the Oval till late at night. But he was really insistent on making the life of his 2 girls as normal as possible. He had his mother-in-law living at the White House. He had Michelle with her garden, which produced wonderful fresh vegetables. They had Sam Cass as their cook. Sam taught the girls how to shop and to cook and to eat healthily. And one of the reasons he was hired is that they were both close to suffering from obesity and diabetes. And Michelle grew very concerned about their health. And so she hired this guy who was a specialist in healthy eating. So he was a very important influence on their private lives, and he helped to drive the garden and to cook from it, and thereby set an example for the nation. And so, in a way, the White House's private kitchen has a big influence on people. I mean, I tell the story of Ronald Reagan, who liked jelly beans, which seems like a very simple detail, but actually it's complicated. He began to eat jelly beans to get off of tobacco. It was also a way of judging people. When people came to visit him and would pick out only one color to eat, he thought that told you something about, in comparison to somebody who would just grab a handful of jelly beans. But he then got himself in a little trouble because jelly beans are sugar. The sugar industry was very important in Washington. And at one point, he cut back the school lunch program by over $1 billion, the funding for it, and infamously declared that ketchup was a vegetable. This caused an uproar because ketchup has a lot of sugar in it, and the message was that sugar is good and nutritious food is bad. The day he announced this cutback happened to coincide, just by chance, with the announcement that Nancy Reagan had bought a beautiful new set of White House china. Even though it was paid for by private donors, they were terribly criticized for cutting back on school lunches, maintaining the
Now you're getting into
tobacco.
the politics of food.
Yes,
and we
exactly.
stay away from politics at the White House
Well, it's
Historical
just- it is
Association. But the
fascinating.
point is well made. Not unlike the broccoli lobby, who was probably upset with George
were.
H.W.
They were.
Bush when he declared he did not like
Exactly
broccoli.
right, yeah.
So, well, I'd like to talk a little more about the White House kitchen garden that was made so famous by Mrs. Obama. But that was not the first garden at the White House, or when things were grown at the White House for the White House kitchen. We mentioned the cow early on, but there were other ways of growing and providing for the White House kitchen right there on the White House grounds. You didn't go to the grocery store. you provided through the resources at the White House itself. Give us a flavor of that over the years.
When Mrs. Obama decided to create that garden, it was considered kind of a radical act, tearing up this beautiful lawn. But actually, it was a throwback to the early days when a lot of the early presidents had gardens because that's how they lived. So there were garden plots there. One of my favorite stories is about Calvin Coolidge, who was brought up on a farm in Vermont, which you can go visit today. He learned to make cheese, Plymouth cheese, which is still delicious. And he liked to keep his own chickens. And so he built a coop, and the chickens ended up tasting like mint. And they discovered that the coop had been built on top of Teddy Roosevelt's mint garden, which he'd grown for his mint juleps. And I always liked that story.
I'd like to close our conversation by putting you on the spot with 2 questions. Given your knowledge of White House chefs, White House food and cuisine over the years, if you could have a dinner prepared by a White House chef throughout history, a meal served by them, who would you choose and what would you choose?
There's so many choices here. That's a tough one. Today, I'll say, I think it would be fun to have been at a dinner prepared by Valentino Mela, who was the chef for U.S. Grant and produced these 30-course extravaganzas. When you look at the menus, they're kind of incredible. But I could easily say James Hemmings or René Verdun or even Christetta Comerford, who's there now.
Sure. Well, setting aside any political influence, if you could dine with 2 or 3 American presidents, given their food interests and food preferences, who would you choose? And First Ladies, I'll add.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, I would have to say Thomas Jefferson, the Kennedys, Eisenhower, and maybe Obama.
And wouldn't that make a nice dinner party?
Yeah. I was going to say FDR, but because he was a great gourmet, but Eleanor was not, and so we would save him for the next one.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation and for writing this book. It's extraordinary, and I know that the followers of the White House 1600 sessions will enjoy this, as well as the new book on Chef Haller that we have recently republished with your wonderful introduction. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your knowledge and sharing it with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Stuart, and let's break bread together.
Let's do that. Thank you. Thank you all for listening and watching today. I've had the great privilege to bring you stories like the one here today since the program began in 2017. You can listen to the dozens of interviews I've done over the years on your favorite podcast provider, or you can watch them on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All of us here at the White House Historical Association, thank you for your support. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, and even this podcast. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.